Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Matt Scalisi, and we are here on a Tuesday morning to get into one of the big stories that's dominating the headlines in the SEC, as we do every week here on First Down South. I am joined by my co-hosts, two of the best reporters covering the SEC today. That would be Matt Zenitz and John Talty. And guys, we're deep into May. There's other sports that really I think are getting a lot more airtime right now. But in terms of college football, there's a lot going on. And we know that college football in this part of the country, it doesn't take a lot for them to take over the headlines and become the top story down here. But, the transfer market has obviously been something we've talked about on this show already. It's been a big part of this offseason. It's a continuing story. It is fascinating to me that we're this deep into the offseason. We're to me at this point, it feels like we're closer. We're getting closer to talking about fall camp and getting ready for the real season, and yet there's still so much work being done to shape rosters for the fall. And I think the big name that we're all talking about around the conference this week is TJ Finley, the former LSU quarterback who is transferring. Looking at several different schools, but John, I want to bring this up with you first. This is a weird time to be continuing to court and discuss bringing a new quarterback into your program who would be immediately eligible. And we're talking about the season's a few months away at this point. I mean, talk about shaping your roster late. I mean, there's nothing you could do to have a greater impact on your season than bringing in a new starting quarterback potentially.
Well, first off, I think that's a big jump to say they're potentially bringing a new starting quarterback. We'll get there in a second. But
okay.
I think let's look at it this way. You can there's a lot going on here. First off, not to go too deep into this, transfer market has changed everything. We've seen it in basketball for a while now. We're seeing it in football. If everybody's getting free transfers, it's going to change the way we do things. Second part of this, if you look at it like, all right, they just went through spring practice. They saw what their strengths were. They saw what their weaknesses were. So it actually in some ways makes a lot of sense to say, okay, we don't have anyone on the roster right now who can challenge Bo. Why don't we go out and potentially get that guy? And that could be TJ Finley. That could be one possible answer as to why, he ends up at Auburn. But it is weird, but I just think it's different. We talked about it in previous shows of Alabama. All right, they identified some things that were not a strength. We needed a speedy receiver, so they go out and get that. And I think that's what you're going to see the top teams be able to do. And it's happened in the past as well. This isn't completely a new phenomenon, but I think you'll see more of it with just the transfers that are happening. And so I think with Finley, that's kind of where it checks out, is that you've seen, A, he started games in the SEC last year, so there's talent there. But B, all these schools have gone through their spring practice and they know what they have and what they don't have. And there's value in adding a guy like Finley, who is, a known commodity to some extent at this point.
Well, first of all, John, I do agree with you. I don't think this guy's has an expectation around him that he's going to come in and be a high-level starter for a major player in the SEC. But because we look, as you said, we look at what he did a year ago. He did get some starting experience, but 5 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He was pretty shaky at times when we saw him in action for LSU. The question then is, if you're TJ Finley, why would you transfer out of a situation where you're a backup right now and look at schools where you're going to have a really tough time winning a starting job? I guess I'm a little bit curious about how the math makes sense for him in that case, instead of, let's say, dropping down to a smaller conference or just a lower level of competition where you can win a starting job.
Well, let's see where he ends up first. I think that, could answer that question. But if you read our colleague Tom Green had an interview with TJ Finley over the weekend, and he says in there basically, like, if I feel like I can compete against Bo for the starting job, then I would potentially go to Auburn. So I think he's smart enough. I think it seems like in his comments, he realizes that, like, he's not going to go to Auburn unless he thinks he has a shot to beat out Bo. So if he ends up at Auburn, either he's totally misguided and just doesn't realize how entrenched Bo is at that spot, and some of his comments I feel like hinted at this, maybe the coaches have indicated to him, this is a little bit more open than maybe you think it is. And like, if you come in and prove you're the best, like this is a meritocracy. We're a new staff. If you're the guy, we'll let you be the guy. So that's, I think, would be a big thing. I mean, at Alabama, it seems Bryce is, again, pretty entrenched in that position. I think Nick Saban has been pretty, publicly praising and complimentary of him. So if TJ Finley goes there, again, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to me because I don't think he's beating out Bryce Young, but maybe he thinks he can. So I think where he actually ends up and what the QB situation is there, I think will be very interesting. But at least what he's saying right now is that he is taking that into account in terms of where he goes.
I'll leave this to either of you, but I think TJ Finley's still a pretty young guy at this point. He's still relatively early in his career, unlike I think what we've seen traditionally on the transfer market, especially for quarterbacks. You're usually looking at guys who maybe they've got 1 year left to go and play somewhere, maybe two. But the part of what this change in the NCAA rules has allowed is guys can have one season at a school and transfer essentially without penalty one time to a different school. And in some ways, I wonder if look, obviously this is just one guy we're talking about, but it's an interesting example of what we could see more of in the transfer market in the future, where it's a guy who kind of had a false start where he first committed. And maybe you do go somewhere where you can't start right away, but the long-term option for you looks better. We'll just bring up Auburn as the example with TJ Finley. I mean, maybe he sees that situation and says, well, maybe I don't beat Bo Nix out this year, but Bo's probably only going to be there one more year, and maybe I've got a good long-term future at a program like that.
I think that's a fair point. The big thing that I'll say about TJ Finley, if you look at some of the schools that are pursuing him, have been in contact with him, and I'll look specifically at the two in-state schools with Alabama and Auburn. Those are programs with guys in the number one role right now, going to be very difficult to beat out. But at the same time, there are programs where it's very fair for them to have concerns about the depth at the quarterback position and the number two spot. So for Alabama, I think that it would be very fair for them to have some concerns if something did happen to Bryce Young, being left in a position where potentially Paul Tyson could be thrown in there based on just spring for him. And then Jalen Milroe, the true freshman, did some good things throughout the course of the spring, but at the same time, they may feel like he's not necessarily ready if it came to that. And with TJ Finley, you have somebody where, look, it comes in and blows the doors off and beats out Bryce Young, then cool from their perspective. But at the same time, worst case scenario, you have somebody who can come in, has starting experience in the SEC, and provides additional depth there and alleviate some of the concern that would come along with something potentially happening to Bryce Young. And the same thing from Auburn's perspective. Most likely he comes in, especially during the summer. This isn't him arriving in December or January and having the whole spring to make a move in a competition. This would be somebody coming in during the course of the summer and having a limited window to make an impression during the course of a competition. That's tough, especially when you have an established starter there. I would say it's similar to the Alabama deal, where best case scenario comes in, blows the doors off, and beats Bo Nix out, then cool. But at the same time, the worst case scenario is you have somebody with starting experience in the SEC that can come in and provide additional depth. If he's looking for a situation where wants to start immediately, I would say some of the other schools that he's thrown out, the Texas A&Ms of the world that have lost their starting quarterback from last year and have guys competing right now where don't have a set starter, that would be a more realistic situation for him in terms of getting a job right now. But at the same time, if he's looking at this in terms of being a long-term play, maybe Alabama or Auburn isn't the worst thing in the world, where come in, serve as a backup to somebody like Bryce Young for a couple of years, and then you have a chance to take over at a program like Alabama, where you've seen what obviously they've done from a passing game perspective during the course of the last couple of years. So I think it comes down to what his priorities are, whether it's legitimately to come in and start right away, or if this is, as it should be, a long-term type play, a long-term type decision where he's looking for the best kind of situation for him that will put him in a spot where it can have the best college success overall and ultimately prepare him for the next level. But it comes down to what the priorities are here.
Yeah, and John, I do want to touch on. I want to go back to something that you touched on a minute ago about how different programs are kind of utilizing the transfer market differently during the offseason. And you mentioned Alabama kind of came out of spring and said, look, we've identified some weak spots where we could use some help, and we're going to go out and get some guys at those positions. I think we're seeing it on a much different and more widespread scale being used by Brian Harsin and his staff at Auburn right now. And we'll get into some specific examples of that in a minute, but just your thoughts, John, on specifically kind of what Auburn is doing. And does it seem like maybe this is what we're going to see when we have a coaching change in the SEC going forward, is that you can kind of, in a much larger way than you've ever been able to do before, you can kind of remake the roster into what you want it to be a little bit more right when you arrive?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that came to mind for me when you're talking about that is that Nick Saban's going into year 15 and Brian Harsin's going into year 1. I mean, there's a natural difference there in terms of, Brian Harsin has only recruited a few of the guys that are on that roster, whereas Nick Saban has recruited all of them. And so, Alabama's going to have misses. There are going to be guys who leave, and there's going to be guys who come in. But, I mean, for Harsin, there's maybe some similarities in terms of what he likes to do offensively. There should be at least some players that, that fit what he wants to do. But, there are obviously differences from him and Gus. And so, there's naturally going to be that need. I do think you'll see, some turnover. I think it's a little bit different. I think it's easier in basketball, as we've talked about in the past, because you need less players and you can turn over. I mean, we're seeing some massive turnover in basketball where, you're having 9 guys leave the program in one offseason, which, is the majority of your team in basketball. So I think you see a little bit more of that. Football is a little bit harder just based on scholarship limits and things like that. How many guys you're taking into each class. You got to be a little bit more methodical about how you bring guys in. But I think it makes a lot of sense what I'm seeing Harsin doing. And again, I know we're going to get into some of the other guys that they're interested in. But to me, it seems like, Harsin's a smart guy. He saw what he had in the spring. He saw some strengths. He saw some weaknesses. Certainly, they saw some things defensively that they realized they needed to, improve upon, which we'll get to in a second. But I think that it makes a lot of sense. And, I think Auburn's also kind of in the have of the have and have-nots, even if in the SEC, like, you come into a new program like Vanderbilt, some of your guys are getting picked away from you, whereas
Sure, yeah.
Auburn, you're not losing your top players to other programs. And so that's the thing that other coaches are dealing with. Auburn's in a good enough spot where they can kind of get out and choose some guys they want, whereas other programs right now, with how crazy it is out there, like you're almost having to recruit your own guys to stay. And Auburn really doesn't have to do that much. I mean, there were a lot of rumors about Tank Bigsby out there right when he took over, but other than that, for the most part, they haven't really been that worried about losing top guys.
That's a good point, John. That I often don't have perspective on as somebody who primarily is covering Alabama and Auburn. I'm not used to seeing the schools that I cover get guys just sort of constantly picked off from them, but that's a big part of this transfer market is, as you said, ultimately it's going to be about players using that freedom to put themselves in a better position. And for a lot of guys, that means going to a program that already has a lot of advantages and resources that the other programs don't. Matt, let's get into the defensive side of Auburn's shifting roster. And I just want to mention real quickly, we do have some user questions, and I'm going to get to those right after we finish talking about some of these transfer names that we wanted to get to. But hang tight. We're going to get to your questions. But Matt, yeah, John mentioned defense has been a big area of emphasis in the transfer market so far. We saw Auburn land the defensive lineman from UAB. A couple of other names, though, that have that either have already joined on with Auburn or will be likely at some point this week.
Yeah, so they got a commitment from a top FCS transfer the other day by Darius Knighton, a versatile kid who played safety at Southeast Missouri State, but somebody that Auburn coaches view as being versatile and flexible enough that can play safety, can play nickel, play dime, gives them some additional flexibility there. Two-time all-conference player, intelligent, and they were impressed with him throughout the course of the recruiting process, both in terms of his mental makeup and then that overall versatility. But at the same time, even after adding him as a DB the other day, that hasn't stopped them from pursuing an additional defensive back transfer. And that's something really to keep an eye on during the course of the day tomorrow. So Donovan Kaufman is one of the top available defensive transfers at this point, was at Vanderbilt. And I know Vanderbilt doesn't exactly produce on a consistent basis.
Jumped on it here.
But he was, in terms of Donovan Kaufman, one of the top up-and-coming players on Derek Mason's Vanderbilt team last year, and was said to be maybe the top overall player on the team, at the very least, maybe the best overall defensive player on that Vanderbilt roster going into the season. Ultimately decides to leave, and Auburn is in a very strong position to add him heading into his commitment tomorrow morning. And that's someone, the reason this is noteworthy, that's a potential starter for them at free safety. So ideally for Auburn, and the secondary is one of the strengths of this team, of this defense heading into the year. But ideally for them, they wanted to have Ladarius Tennyson, who's been working at the safety spot next to Smoke Monday, move back down to the nickel spot that he's played before, and adding somebody like Donovan Kaufman will put them in a position where they're able to do that. And overall, if this goes as expected with him committing to Auburn, that secondary, which was already in good shape, is in even better shape after adding the combination of Bidarius Knighton the other day, and then potentially Donovan Kaufman tomorrow. But Auburn's been one of the more interesting teams from a transfer perspective. And it's not just limited to TJ Finley or the defensive backfield. So they're in the market for a transfer running back, would like to add additional depth there, like we've talked about before, behind Tank Bigsby and Sean Shivers, and a kid to keep an eye on in terms of a running back transfer would be Jordan Ingram, a local kid, spent last year at Central Michigan, played at St. Paul's in high school, ran for 1,400 yards as a senior there. That's somebody that Auburn would be one of the teams to keep an eye on for him. And then also in the market for additional depth and talent within the front seven. And a kid who's come up as one to keep an eye on for Auburn is Marcus Harris from Kansas, who led Kansas, another program similar to Vanderbilt. I know people don't necessarily look at Kansas as one of the top talent producers on a national level, but kid who led them with 7.5 tackles for a loss last year. And Auburn is in the mix with him to go along with the other guys that we've talked about.
Matt, you mentioned Auburn trying to add some depth in the running back spot. Alabama may be facing a little bit of the opposite problem, and we've got a question from one of our commenters watching today regarding that. Joey Baker wants to know, do y'all see any of Alabama's running backs transferring out due to an overcrowded backfield? What are your feelings? I mean, we saw a lot of these guys last year, really. There was a pretty good amount of playing time that we saw for those younger backs, but there's a lot of guys, and they're all, they all came out of high school highly touted. I'm sure that they get antsy sitting on the bench. What are either of your feelings about how that's going to shake out?
It's probably inevitable, just like is the case with Alabama's wide receiver room. But at the same time, it would be premature to guess any individual guys because the competition is still ongoing for playing time. And I know that doesn't necessarily give the answer that I'm sure Joey was looking for. But
specifically, Joey did ask, do you think anybody will transfer out? You're saying that's probably going to happen at some point.
Yeah, I mean, that's just
there's only one ball.
It's just the nature of college football and the transfer market right now. But at the same time, I'll emphasize it would be premature to guess any individual guys because these competitions are still going on. And it's the great thing from a coaching perspective. So it's great as a coach, whether it's Robert Gillespie with Alabama's running back room or Holman Wiggins with Alabama's receiver room. It's great to have as much talent as possible. But at the same time, it's a challenge to go along with that, keeping all of these talented guys happy and trying to prevent as much as possible turnover within your individual rooms. But those are competitions with the Alabama running back room, the Alabama receiver room, going to be some of the more interesting competitions to follow throughout the course of the summer and fall camp.
And I'll say this, I mean, I think what Alabama does, Alabama, I think, has done a very good job historically of managing this situation. And they've obviously lost, running backs over the years. Alvin Kamara is the most, prominent one. But I think there's two things that they do. One, they'll tell you, hey, less tread on the tires is a good thing for your future professional career. So, you might not get the ball as much as if you went to X school, but it's actually going to benefit you long term to do that. And with that, they'll point out to guys like, hey, look at a Kenyon Drake. Never really started here, but he still is now in his second contract in the NFL. And he's, actually probably third contract now, I think, with the Raiders. So, hey, you can make a lot of money and still never even be a starter here. All you need is just the opportunity, a couple opportunities here and there. So I agree with Matt. It's going to be hard to manage that situation. It always is. But I think Alabama has enough of a track record that they like to point back to, okay, we've dealt with this before. We've had extremely talented stacked running back rooms. And here's how it kind of worked out. Look at where all these guys are now. Even, if they didn't get as many carries as you thought they would. And Najee Harris is a great example. Anywhere else he went, he would have been the guy probably from the get-go. Barely gets used his first 2 years. Was thinking about transferring. They keep him, and now he's a first-round pick.
And Josh Jacobs, another great. Josh Jacobs was never the guy at Alabama, not once. He was never the starter. And he's definitely. He's essentially the starter for the Raiders right now.
Yeah, and something I'll add in to go along with that, not only in terms of the running back room, but the receiver room also. With both of those situations for Alabama, the competitions would have been interesting enough to follow just based on the players that saw throughout the course of the spring and then the Jameson Williams of the world that added recently. But let's not forget, with both of those situations, the running back room and the receiver room set to add some highly ranked, really talented true freshmen who will make the competitions for playing time even more interesting. With the running back situation, have Cam Wheaton, one of the 25 five-star recruits that Alabama had in this last recruiting class, but one of the top running backs nationally who I don't think came to Alabama just to sit on the bench for a year and do absolutely nothing, and a kid who's talented enough that maybe could be in position to factor into that competition for playing time. And then as far as the receiver situation, have JoJo Earl, who was a top 50 overall recruit nationally. I remember during the recruiting process, there was at least one SEC coach who referred to him as having some Jalen Waddle-like characteristics. I think we remember Jalen Waddle, obviously, an impact guy right away at Alabama. And if he flashes anything like that throughout the course of the summer and fall camp, could make that receiver situation that was already interesting in terms of the competition for playing time even more interesting and competitive moving forward into the season.
I think the big takeaway here is that Bill O'Brien has a lot of weapons to play with.
Yeah, not a bad situation
last year.
Yeah, not a bad situation to be stepping into. Thank you, Joey, for the question. And we do that every week. So yeah, if you guys ever want us, we've got a show planned to talk about every week, but we're happy to divert and talk about whatever you guys want to talk about or answer your questions about the SEC every week. We're gonna go ahead and wrap it up for this week. But thanks to everybody for watching, and thanks to Joey for your question. You can listen to us on your favorite podcast platform in audio form if you want to. You can find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts by searching for First Down South. And you can find great coverage from these guys and the rest of our staff over at AL.com. What was that head shake, John?
I think he's shaking his head at just the unique triumvirate that we represent.
That's right.
Two of us to go along with bearded Elijah Wood. I think that's the main thing that John was shaking his head at.
If you have any questions about Beethoven the movie, Matt Zanitz would be happy to answer them.
I've seen it like 50 times during the course of the last 3 months at this point. A favorite of Miles Zenitz.
What you can't see is just off camera on that brick wall is a poster of Charles Grodin. Matt's a huge fan, so please send in your questions about Beethoven the movie franchise, any of those, and Matt will be happy to answer them.
We got a nice mixture recently, so not to get too off the rails, but
we're way off the rails now.
Miles has branched out a little bit, so it's not just Beethoven. At this point, he's actually branched out to it being a combination of Beethoven, Shrek 1, and Shrek 2. He's a big Shrek.
lot of Shrek talk out there today. It's a trending topic at the moment. So
I feel like now that you bring this up, and again, if anybody's still watching, my apologies, but
there's still dozens of people watching right now.
We really haven't embraced our dad corner better. I have a lot of dad movie and TV show takes. I know that you do as well.
We're getting
a bit, but
we're getting into the thick of the offseason, so we're going to have to lean into things like our dad movie takes at some point on First Down South. So we'll add that in as an extra category in the weeks to come, where we get into our real hot dad takes. We'll get into movies. We'll get into grilling. We'll get into lawn care.
TV show take. If anybody has kids, Jack has recently been into the show Pinky Malinky. It's awful. Would not recommend. But we had a real breakthrough the other day in which we were watching it, and he knows I don't like it, and he turns to me, he's just like, "This show is kind of annoying, isn't it?" I was like, "Yes, it is. Yes, it is."
At least he knows. At least there's self-awareness.
It was like I didn't have to lead him there; he just got there himself, and it was a great moment.
That's good. It's good when your kid can finally be aware that he's doing something that annoys his parents. It's good. Yeah. All right. Well, guys, good luck to both of you this week as you continue your journeys of fatherhood and reporting on the SEC. And we'll be back next week